How do Old and New Testament figures connect? Imagine a story that spans thousands of years, with characters and promises weaving together into one big narrative. That's what makes understanding how Old and New Testament figures connect so fascinating. When we look closely, we see that the stories from long ago aren't just isolated tales. They are part of a bigger plan that God has been unfolding since the beginning. Old Testament figures like Abraham, Moses, and King David are more than just historical characters. They are like pieces of a puzzle that fit into the story of Jesus Christ. For example, God promised Abraham that all nations would be blessed through his family. This promise points forward to Jesus, who is a descendant of Abraham and brings blessing to everyone. Moses led God's people out of slavery, and Jesus offers freedom from spiritual bondage. King David was promised a forever king, and Jesus is called the Son of David, fulfilling that promise. These connections show us how the Old Testament sets the stage for what happens in the New Testament. Many Old Testament characters and events act as symbols or types that point to Jesus. Jacob, who wrestled with God and was renamed Israel, represents God's people on their journey of faith. Jesus is seen as the ultimate fulfillment of Israel's destiny. Melchizedek, a priest-king, foreshadows Jesus' eternal priesthood and kingship. Noah's Ark, which saved people from the flood, is a picture of salvation through Jesus, who rescues us from sin and judgment. These types help us see how God's plans are connected across the ages, making the stories richer and more meaningful. The covenants God made with figures like Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David also link the Old and New Testaments. These promises and agreements build upon each other, creating a continuous story of God's relationship with his people. Jesus comes as the perfect fulfillment of these covenants, bringing a new and better one. This new covenant is based on grace and truth, fulfilling the law and the prophets. It shows us that God's promises are not just for the past but are ongoing, leading us to a deeper understanding of his plan. Jesus' family tree is another clear link. His lineage traces back to Judah and King David, fulfilling prophecies about the Messiah's descent. This genealogical connection confirms that Jesus is the promised Savior, rooted in the history of God's people. It also reminds us that God's promises are rooted in real people and real history. Understanding these connections helps us see the Bible as one big story, not just separate parts. It encourages us to study both testaments together, seeing how they speak to each other. Recognizing that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament promises helps us trust God's plan more fully. It also gives us a richer context for applying biblical principles today, knowing that God's story is ongoing and personal. In the end, the link between Old and New Testament figures shows us that God's plan of salvation is consistent and unbreakable. From promises made to ancient heroes to the life of Jesus, everything points to God's desire to save and restore his people. This connection invites us to see ourselves as part of that story, living in the hope and assurance of God's ongoing work.